Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to the study session, August 23rd, 2022. Donna, would you do a roll call, please?
Yes, I will. Councilmember Bowden,
Here.
Councilmember Sherman,
Here.
Councilmember Gutierrez,
Here.
Mayor Nesco,
Here.
Deputy Mayor Schmidt,
Here.
Councilmember McDowell,
Present.
and Councilmember Peterson.
Here.
All right. Tonight, we're discussing the 2023 budget. Finance Director Mike Givens has information for us. Did I say that properly?
Yes.
All right.
All right. Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and members of council. We're pleased to bring you the first look at the 2023 budget. Whenever I think finance staff start this process in early summer, the rest of staff always sort of look at us like, why are we starting this process so soon? We're just in the throes of spending the current year. But now here we come to the end of August and we're really at the timeline where we're moving pretty quickly, as you know, towards public hearings and then the adoption of the budget. So before, as you know, I'm new on the job for just 3 weeks, and this has been really a big part of my focus, preparing for tonight and really looking at the revenues and the forecast that presenting to you tonight. The process has already been undertaken by the finance staff. The budget calendar that was in your packet and that is presented, I think is a very good one that involves staff, department heads at a good level to make sure that what you're seeing is a budget that provides well for the municipal services that we're responsible to offer. So we started in more earnest this month, meeting with the city manager and department heads to really take a look at their budget proposals so that we can start to bring the budget into balance with revenues and expenses. And then, as we'll present to you at a subsequent study session, really what those initiatives are, and then hear from you in more detail on what your direction is for the budget. A lot of the behind the scenes work that finance staff are working on go into this to create a lot of the not assumptions, but reality and where our labor costs are, and then some other factors that we'll look at. So that's the kind of look at where the process is taking us. We'll have public hearings in which, as you know, the public is invited to participate in the process and give input, and that will happen as the fall progresses. To remind council and others, the city of Shelton operates on an annual budget development process. So we adopt a one-year budget. We're a cash basis entity, so the revenues and expenses are realized in the month that they happen, and our fiscal year is January through December. So as we start the process with that in mind, what we really wanted to look at is kind of forecast. Forecasts are just that. They're an estimate of where we think things are going to be based on our experience and what we can tell with the economy. So what I wanted to take just a few minutes to look at is some economic indicators and the outlook, because I think that gives you a good basis for where we're coming from as we develop this 5-year forecast and the revenue outlook for next year. As you have questions or want us to look at something further, please let me know and we'll get into that in some more detail. There's lots of press about the economy right now. Pretty much every day when you open some sort of news feed, or if you look at the TV news, there's something about predicting a recession or inflation and all of that put together. It's certainly something that when you're in finance, especially in my role to really guide the budget process and revenue, you're looking at it carefully. A few of the factors that I'm really following, number one, that would affect our budget if it changes are property values. So for 2023 taxes, property values are really established at this point in the year because the county assessors have to get that done pretty early into the year. As property owners, we've been mailed the statement, or pardon me, the valuation of our property that tells us, here's what your value is for next year. They don't close the books until later in the fall, but that's really what we're seeing. And having been a new property owner in Mason County, you can get a pretty good look. I got my statement and property values are increasing. So it's kind of an interesting look because having come from Chelan County where it's, you know, every county is different, of course, but that's a county that has Lake Chelan, the Leavenworth area where there's some more tourist properties. They're holding values more flat for next year. So things might be, if you just kind of read into that data, lagging a bit here. I don't think it necessarily says anything other than, as I'm going to talk about a little bit as another indicator, are the interest rates rising. That does tend to affect those buyers into the second home and vacation home market. So for now, while we don't have certified numbers, we can pretty well establish a budget based on the aggregate assessed value is going to increase for next year. If you ever want more talk about the property tax system, as you may know, it's a very complex one in our state. Having worked with it over a number of years, I still sometimes call up county assessors or the Department of Revenue with a question because and you can bet if it confuses us, it definitely confuses property owners. Many times I've received citizen calls where I'm asked, well, how can you tell me that you can only increase 1% if your property tax budget increased 2.7%? And that's because we get a factor for new construction and it's state assessed utilities run across our boundaries. So there's lots of complexity to it, but we can build a budget with some knowns in that property tax line that we can count on. If you adopted a 1% increase with factor for new construction, and that seems to be happening still pretty well across our city limits, so we can build a budget with that known. One of the things in this whole economy that I think sends many of us scratching our head is the labor market. Whenever the new numbers come out, they're baffling because you hear all this gloom and doom, but then for the July numbers, when they came out, the economy added 528,000 jobs. And that's reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It was more than double what they predicted. So then you start to ask yourself, well, then really, how can we be headed towards much of an inflation if the report tells us the US economy has regained all the jobs it lost during the pandemic. So that's a very solid indicator, but then we know other things are going on with inflation and we all feel it if we're business owners, private citizens just going to the store or fueling our vehicle or operating a government like a city. We know that costs are more on every supply chain kind of project we're in, whether it's buying office supplies or anything else, they're up more. And so as you read these indicators, one of the big ones I think that we all watch is the Federal Reserve and that interest rate. And when they ticked it up 0.75 on July 27th to try to, curb inflation and do some things, that definitely was something I think we have to keep an eye on, because the great question is, what does that really do to the housing market in particular? It certainly affects people's ability to borrow money, but how does it affect the overall economy? One of the measures of a recession is the GDP, the gross domestic product. If it has a negative reading for 2 quarters, that's said to be a telltale sign that you're in a recession. Well, it had a negative reading for the second time this year in the preliminary numbers, but we don't really feel like we're necessarily in a recession with great job losses and a high unemployment rate. So it's a tough economy to read. The inflation rate is kind of that final indicator I would bring up. We all know it's high. It hit a 40-year high this year. It slowed a little bit more in July than was expected. And so that gave a little bit of pause, I think, to economists to kind of take a look and say, well, what's that indicating? And I think most people, like finance directors, are sitting there going, well, what does it mean? How do we predict in this? It's a difficult time to try to predict. So as we go through the 5-year forecast, I tried to use some of this data to base some of the revenue projections on. We know for 2023, we have a solid property tax levy because of housing values, but where does it take the rest of the budget? And if you look out further than next year, what do we predict? I wish I could tell you I had accurate 100% prediction skills. Unfortunately, I can just read this data as best I can and try to guide us towards really where I see it going. I tend to err on a little bit more of the conservative side. I did budget in a slowdown to the economy. I'm not going to use the word recession because that's not my place, but should it slow down a bit? Should housing values at the very least equalize a bit? Let's say they don't increase, they just stay where they're at. Then what does that do to our property tax levy? We're going to look at that. And where does it really take us as a municipality towards being able to budget our ongoing expenses that we know are going to increase? So that's what I took into account when looking at the economy and all those indicators that are out there, which are vast and many. And I wish it was more straightforward and I could give you a solid answer. I hope that the economy takes off and does great things because that's the best thing for all of us. So we have a 5-year forecast that you were sent and that the public was able to see. Why it's not longer is because it just gets more difficult as you go out more years. I have one that goes out 10 years, but there are many unknowns in that. For instance, on the expense side, I don't know where we'll be past 2024 with labor contracts. So all I can do is speculate. Other expenses, I don't have a solid read on, but it's good for us to keep that. It shows that trend of where our revenues are going and our expenses, and to try to keep that as we're planning from the administration on really where big projects can happen. The 5-year forecast is just for the general fund because it has the most varied revenue that we really, the proprietary funds we can predict a bit easier, but the general fund is a little bit more elusive because of all of its revenue sources. I also have some assumptions that I wanted to talk with you a little bit about so you could have some basis for really where we're coming from on this 5-year forecast. So some assumptions that I made in preparing this, and I mentioned them a little bit through the economic forecast or indicators that I talked about. And I also base this a great deal on the June financials because that I like June financials because they're a 50% look at the fiscal year. They're enough into it. As you know, sales tax is delayed in being released to cities for months. So you have a good look at kind of where's 2022 taking us, where are not only our revenue is at 50%, but where are expenses? So that was a large basis for guiding kind of where that revenue forecast should go. So for sales tax, if you noticed on the June financials, it's a bit down. And I think that, again, putting on a little bit of or looking into, doing the best I can to estimate that, I held it flat for a couple of years, simply because I think we're at a place where people are at a spending level that's kind of hit a stride, if you will. Considering where wages are, considering where inflation is, I don't want to overestimate that and have us be looking at a $250,000 deficit if it doesn't come in where that is. If we need to do an amendment mid-year because it's coming in much higher, I'd much rather bring you that than to say we're way too high on this and we need to go the other way. So I did take a little bit more of an optimistic view of it later in the 5-year forecast to bump it up to 2% for the final 2 years. assuming that if we do have any kind of a downturn, it's short. And we recover quickly. For property taxes, we're budgeting 2.5% for 23 because we, like I said, we know property values are increasing some across our city limits. We know there's a factor for new construction that's still pretty robust. I'm not in any way predicting that it won't continue to be, but I don't know beyond. So I held it to 1.5% in 2024. And the reason I still am showing an increase is because property that when they set the values, it lags a bit. So even if the housing market recesses, it's going to be a delayed effect to us. So I did hold it flat in 25. So again, I'm being very optimistic, which you don't always hear finance folks being this optimistic, but and then 1% the remaining years. So I'm not giving much of a factor then in those remaining years for new construction, assuming that if there is any kind of an effect from rising interest rates, it would affect new construction a little bit harder. That's not to say that we won't have new construction. I'm just going on a little bit more of the conservative side with a great hope that that's able to be taken up as we develop those subsequent year budgets. The rest of the utility taxes and other taxes are really in municipal code as far as how much those increase, and they're a little bit easier for us to take a look at. Some of the other areas, charges for goods and services, licenses and permits. I really took a look at where we're at June of 2022. I also did a deep dive into what those encompassed to come up with my reasoning for holding them flat for a few years to kind of let them catch up. Again, if we need to, as we develop the 2024 budget and subsequent years, if this prediction is not on target, I'd much rather than take it up than have to take it down. So that's really where I looked at the revenue forecast with those assumptions being what they are. Some of those areas that made the forecast look a little bit different is, of course, the ARPA money that goes away. So it makes it look like we have more money one year and then a big loss, but that's really not the case. That's the way with grants and that sort of one-time federal funding. You don't want to turn it down, but then the next year it looks a little rough because if you don't take that into account, that has to be part of your assumption for creating this. One of the things when I was looking at the revenue budget, we don't increase a whole lot no matter what, even if it's a darn good economy, as the city manager and I have talked a lot about. We really have to be reasonable about what we can expect for things that we know right now today within our city. So for sales tax, even if the economy is strong, which I really think it's pretty strong today, setting aside all those indicators we talked about, it's really at a pretty solid level. We can't expect sales tax or other taxes to grow a whole lot until the city increases in some other ways. Its capacity for residents, has some more businesses, etc. So that's another part of where I'm basing this is on today. It's certainly not to say that things won't change as developments happen, as businesses open and those sorts of things happen. But as we look at the picture today, that's where I'm forecasting that. On the expense side of things, I took a look at what we know right now. We have so wages, because we're a people organization, that's what it takes to run a municipality. Wages and benefits are a big part of our budget, as you know. So in those first years of this forecast, we have labor contracts. I have some knowns to budget off of, but beyond that, I don't know. So the forecast is just that. It's using some assumptions. I'm by no means guaranteeing that's what those will be for anyone, but it's to give us a look at the forecast and predictions. Benefits are the same. I just used a flat amount. I hope it's not that much. I hope it's not 6.5%, but that's just the level that we're gonna plan for. If it's better than that, I'll be happy, you'll be happy. If it's worse, we'll correct as we go along. For the other supplies, we used a higher factor as we brought the baseline budget over for 2023 to increase supply and services budgets because we know they're going to be a great deal more in 23 than they were in 2022, and there wasn't as large a factor increase given for 2022. As the budgets developed, we may have to work with that a little bit. Again, it's still in the early stages. Not everything has even been presented to the city manager yet, so we have to put all that together. We may do some changing on that, but you know it's costing us more. You're hearing it in some of the contracts that are being brought to you, that the costs are just higher, and it's across every business and government agency is facing that. So as we brought baseline in, we did give a higher factor in 23 than I allowed for in the subsequent years, because I'm assuming that'll equalize out a little bit more. At least I'm hoping it will equalize out a little bit more in the subsequent years. And then some assumptions, because we haven't made some final decisions on our ER&R and what we're for sure going to propose with that. So I'm again making some assumptions that the city manager needs to work. We need to work together to come up with, but this was just a first look at if we keep things in this direction we're going with the current staffing, services being what they are today, this is where it would be. And as you can see, it looks okay for 2023, but it gets a little bit more negative as we go down the 5-year forecast because our costs increase more than our revenue does if we keep everything the same as it is right now. So it's helpful for us in finance, and I hope it is for you as the council to take a look at that 5-year plan so that you know we're giving careful consideration to the planning of the budget to take into account our limited revenue growth and the options that we have really within that. Because we know our citizenry are just as burdened with expenses as we are as a municipality. So that's what we're looking at. As we develop the budget, we'll be taking the revenues and the expenses that we know we want to, the projects, the programs that we know we want to achieve in 2023 and bringing that into balance because we're required to by law. So when we bring you the proposed budget, it will be in balance, and we'll ask for your input as to kind of, is this the direction you want to see? We also will have an opportunity, of course, then for that to be subsequently brought out to the public so that they can be involved in the process and take part in it. Our next steps will be, once we conclude the staff presentations with the city manager, to then sit down and start to look at the revenue for the general fund and the rest of the funds, and really how does this now match to what we can expect for revenue. Typically, the expenses are going to be more than the revenue, and then it's our job to bring it into balance and to bring to you a balanced presentation. And at that point, give us some input. So I'm going to pause there and let you ask any questions or make any comments so that we can take note of those so that we can be working on them in the subsequent weeks. Our next budget talk is a study session on September 27th before we go to more public meetings with the actual proposed budget.
Any comments or questions at this time?
I have kind of a silly question. What is court of last resort?
It's, as I understand it, it's a chance for, if something didn't make it into the budget, it's a chance for that department head to go to the city manager and really say, this is needed because of these other things you may not have thought about.
Okay.
I like to call it my chance to say no twice.
Pretty much all that.
Well, it kind of sounded, court of last resort, like, if needed, you know.
You think he calls witnesses?
Do you
Crossing
do you think that sales taxes are down just because everybody's on vacation and nobody's doing that? Because we really benefited a lot from the online shopping, and so is the county. The county's sales taxes through the roof.
Mhm.
So I was just wondering, maybe you think that July was, or was it, are we reporting June or July? June is
June,
because
there's a-
everybody's on vacation, maybe out of town, and nobody's doing the online
But
shopping
there's a
right
lag
now,
on
or
that,
shopping
Eric.
in town, huh?
But remember, there's the couple month lag on that, so the June numbers are actually reflecting from the spring.
So what, and Mike, feel free to answer too, but what I see in that is we've been on a pretty steady upward trend for a while. And it's starting to soften a little bit, and I think a lot of that has to do with the 9.1% inflation is what it was reported as. But what Mike mentioned earlier was a lot of our sales tax, a lot of the shopping that is done here is, a lot of it's necessities. We don't have a car dealership, we don't have, you know, a lot of those big ticket items that are great to have in a steady or strong economy. When they nosedive and the organization has tended to rely on those revenues, that's when it can cause a big problem. So it's both a blessing and a curse.
That was the point about, the spending power is pretty much plateauing because I don't know how many times you can go buy groceries a week, or you know what I mean? That's the community we live in. We pretty much, like you said, it's only necessity items, no real,
When some of that too is the online shopping, and thankfully we get the sales tax from that, from those online shopping. Things that people purchase, and have shipped to their door. But I think it's true, a couple of different factors that record inflation had an impact. I don't necessarily see sales tax revenues nosediving. But as Mike mentioned, I don't think they're going to grow substantially anytime soon either, unless we have additional economic development opportunities that provide the opportunity for people to shop here rather than driving to Thurston County.
in the past, we've seen sales tax growth when we're conducting larger construction projects. I know we're doing a few decent projects, and is that kind of brought into the fold in this discussion, or is that not large enough?
It's significant size. It's not nearly as large as what was it, Basin 4, the one coming down Alder,
Basin 3.
Basin 3. So not nearly as large as that one, but it will have some impact. Yeah.
I have another question, an explanation. What is transfer out under expense assumptions?
So that's an interesting category that I had to do a little bit of looking into, because it's a category that accounts for a number of things, and I don't want to put Terry on the spot, but she's here also if you have questions. Transfers out are to other funds. So for instance, when the general fund transfers money to the street fund, that's one example of that. So it's transfers that happen to other funds that the general fund is supporting. So one fund can't benefit another, but the general fund can support projects that are going on.
All right.
How was that?
I got it.
Okay.
I think that's all my
At this
questions.
point, any more questions? Okay, you can continue.
And I think we
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there were just two big parentheses that I was looking at, was the intergovernmental revenue and solid waste.
Mhm.
And could you enlighten me on why there's big brackets on it?
On our on the monthly financial?
Yeah.
So on the intergovernmental, it's is it down? Are you on a specific page, and I'll
Oh,
look
okay.
with you?
I was just looking at the citywide overview. And also, and on the capital improvement fund, and then also the solid waste fund.
C Street?
And I think
What
he's talking
page
about
are you on?
the transfer in and out for
Okay.
capital improvement.
Was that what it's?
Transfers for the capital improvements. So for Western Gateway.
Oh, because it hasn't.
Yeah, just the brackets, what? Like, that's what highlighted me, and I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we're preparing the financial, we haven't completed some of those transactions because we do wait until later in the year. So that's why it may show that right now, as of this time, we're predicting that because we don't have a all that sophisticated in algorithms. Sometimes we can take into account that, well, we know we're gonna receive that in a large amount at that point. The intergovernmental revenues are sometimes received at specific times, like the marijuana tax that passes through to us, and real estate excise tax, those come in different kind of chunks, if you will, so that sometimes it also. We also, just as I said, we just use a mathematical formula, and sometimes it looks worse than it actually will turn out at year's end when we make the final adjustment.
It was just the largest drop offs that.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
that's still for the C Street, isn't it? The
Yeah,
the
so
sewer
that's
fund.
there. We're getting started on that project. I believe the bid's out for C Street. Soon, not, but so the bid hasn't quite gone out yet, but it will. Now it's just a matter of what we predicted it would cost versus what the bid comes in at. And you've seen several of those so far, so kind of know what to expect at this point.
At one point, we had enough grants to cover the whole project, but it sounds like we don't any longer.
Well, we won't know until the bids come in, but I'd say that's pretty likely.
So you talked about the revenue, tax revenue from marijuana. I didn't think the city got any of that.
We do, I think. We get it through
Do we?
Intergovernmental.
So what is the number on that? What we,
I can get you how much. It's not much. It's in that larger intergovernmental amount, but we can get it for you.
I don't know why I was under the assumption. Okay. I'd like to have that.
Yes, you can continue.
Okay. I don't have a lot left. This really was a chance for you to, I think, feel like you're hearing how we're basing this beginning part of the budget process, to know what the calendar is, but to also know we're paying special attention to planning for the future so that we're not either overcommitting in staffing resources or in obligating our projects to not be able to continue that, so that our citizens see a great decrease in services in the future. We certainly can't take into account everything, as we've talked about with the economy, but we can plan for it. You have solid policies that you've adopted around an ending fund balance. As you can tell in the forecast, I made sure we continue to adhere to that. But I think one of the things that it shows me is we still have to be mindful about our expenses, in that we have a finite amount of resource and it doesn't increase as much as we necessarily would like it to. But we also have to take into account, I think, what our citizens can afford, and everybody's budget is really tight with inflation the way it is, and it's hard to keep up, and we're no different as a municipality, but I think we just have to be mindful of that balance between knowing what we can afford and what our revenue is going to be. I think we talk about a lot also the labor market. It's a difficult one when you talk about that low unemployment rate. It's tough to attract people. You want to retain people. That tends to cost more. So that's why our wages are, at the place they are. And some of us have talked, I don't know that that will change anytime soon. No, it's hard to predict what the labor market will do. I certainly don't want to see a recession that drives up unemployment. That's not a good thing for any of us, but the balance right now is also out of sync a bit from where we've ever seen it, in that it's so hard for, you just hear it across sectors of the economy where people are having trouble hiring and retaining people. I keep having encounters with different vendors myself in my personal life, and I'm like, well, we would have gotten to you sooner, but I can't hire enough people. It's that story you keep hearing. So those wage costs, I've really tried to be mindful of where we're at today, but being able, it's different. It's heartbreaking sometimes when, as the finance director, you can't put more money in that to add more police officers or positions when you know they're greatly needed. But you also want to be able to retain the staff you have, make a commitment to providing municipal services, and you don't want to overcommit. So that 5-year forecast, I think, is useful to really take us down towards where we need to be watching expenses and then the revenues coming in line with that. So it looks a little ominous out at year 5. If you look down at those negative numbers. But that's not taking into account all of the knowns. I'm being pretty liberal with the expenses and conservative with the revenue. We'll bring that more in line as we plan the final budget and bring it into the next years. But if all things were even where they are right now, that's where it would take us. So we also don't want to set people's sights on we can do so much more in services, but there's certainly considerations being made to do absolutely everything we can to provide what our citizens are accustomed to with what we have.
More rooftop would probably be nice, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
You're probably not been here long enough. Our investments, are they affecting us at all?
Well, interestingly, our interest is better when the economy, when higher interest rates for borrowing go up, where the way we're invested is a very good thing. So that's the benefit. We don't get as great of gains when the economy's rolling, but it's safe and liquid and secure. So we're earning well.
One more question. So would the line under B and O, would that be the marijuana? It said other. No, what would the other be? Under B and O,
Under B and O,
yeah, on the,
The next row on the table.
yeah. Sales, property, non-city utilities, city utilities.
Oh,
beach
other-
utilities.
it's where we kind of fit in things that are just other types of taxes, and I can get you more
Okay.
detail on that. Marijuana actually comes from, we classify it because of how we have to with the BAR's manual, the state auditor dictates it comes in under intergovernmental.
Oh, okay.
Because it's an excise tax, it's labeled a marijuana excise tax, so it comes in that intergovernmental where we get the liquor board, PUD excise, and those other
Okay,
kinds of state ones.
all right.
I don't think I took good notes on the other. And I don't want to just guess, so let me go into our system and get you more detail on
Okay.
other.
So, yeah, this is just the baseline budget, moving things forward from what council adopted in 2022. What we're going to be doing over the next several weeks is making decisions based on your strategic plan and your guiding principles that you looked at earlier this year, and deciding which programs to advance for your consideration during the public hearings, and present those to you. And you can tell us if we're in the right spot or if we need to go do a little more work, and we'll get the 2023 budget where you'd like to see it for adoption.
So kind of just as a comment or maybe conversation, but so based on the outlook, I'm gonna assume that we're gonna be looking at flat staffing and no changes in programming. So that'll be like what, the 4th or 5th year of budget development now, where we've kind of just been keeping the lights on.
At the moment, that seems pretty likely. Even if we had the revenue to add staff or programs for 23. If that goes away in 24 or 25, that's not good protection of the taxpayers' dollars.
Right.
Not to be looking out further. So we don't want to look at the big shiny thing for 2023, but not be able to afford it in 2024 or 25. So that's kind of how I view it going forward.
And so with that, I kind of would fall back to, if we're looking at prioritizing and, preliminary budget items, it's very, at least to myself, it's very important that we ensure that we're taking care of the stuff that we have first and foremost, and, avoiding deferring maintenance on things if they need it at this point. Obviously building new would be great, but I'm not hearing a rosy outlook at this point, but So a priority for me would be just making sure we're managing and operating what we have in the best way we can. And then at the same time, if there are strategic investments that are going to create flexibility or bolster our general fund. Because like, Mikey had mentioned, 5 years out, it looks fairly bleak, but not to be flippant about it, but I mean, we've been looking at that for 4 years. So that's, now we're looking 10 years at 10 years, right, at a widening gap between the expenses of running the core functions of the city and what we're actually bringing in revenue. And again, we want to create sustainable economy. We have to do something to bolster that general fund, which again, rooftops, commercial entities, because again, I'm looking at our top 2-3 revenue generators is property tax, sales tax, and intergovernmental transfers and D&O, right? So if we're not selling things beyond necessity, we're gonna plateau and we're kind of there.
So the way the taxing structure is set up in our state. With the 1% cap on property taxes, the only way that you can increase revenue to match the rate of inflation in normal times, not to mention now, is to increase opportunities for sales tax.
Yeah.
And that can prove incredibly difficult when you don't have the rooftops to support new brick and mortar retail opportunities. So one of the focuses that we're working on is just that, is increasing the rooftops available for in the trade area for retailers to take a look at and say that's an attractive place to be. The other thing, to your point about taking care of things, I think we had a concrete example of that last week with the fire alarm discussion at the library. If we can get ahead of those things, they're generally cheaper and we don't have to take away from a program what council thought was important last year, which was the access control. And we still think it's important, staff does, but we have this priority that we have to take money from something that we think is necessary to fix a problem. Where if we can get ahead of those things, that would be great. That would be ideal.
And I don't necessarily want to set anything in stone or suggest that. It's just, I think when staff are bringing you suggestions, if it's not necessarily something that is, going to take care of an existing need, it needs to benefit the general fund as much as possible if we're going to spend money on it in the coming few years. I just, like I said, not trying to be flippant about it, but we've been dead flat ever since I've been on the council. We haven't really seen much on that front, so.
One more. I'm asking all these questions about what something means. What is fines and penalties?
Fines and penalties
I hate that word.
are traffic infractions, municipal court fines, and then other non-traffic fines are what we put into that line.
Okay. So are we expecting the fines to go down in the future?
I think on that one, I was just holding it flat for a few years, assuming that we wouldn't have a lot of growth in it. And then I put a 1% on in the final year. Because as in looking at where we were at June for that one, it's down quite a bit from our budgeted amount.
Right.
So I don't want to take a cut to it because that reduces our revenue, but I think the budget may just be a little bit optimistic. So even if it does grow a little bit in what we take in, I think holding it flat is the right
Okay,
move for that.
thank you.
And I don't want to say that we're going to be writing more tickets or obligate us. I don't mean that in any way. It's just holding it at that level.
All right,
I think it's still probably even from pre-pandemic and things were changed during that and it's still coming back. So
okay.
we may
thank you.
see that come up a little bit just in its normal pace.
Some of those are budgeted too for people that do work without a building permit. And then when they do come in after their stop work, come in to get a building permit, typically what our code requires is that we double the fee. Right?
Mhm.
And that's not something that we always do, although it's something that we have the ability to do if we need to.
So that it's actually then banked as a penalty. Not as a fee per se.
Any more questions? Yes, you're free. Does council have any new items for discussion? New items? No? Then, this study session is adjourned at 8:44 PM.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.